Good morning, everybody. Greetings from London, and welcome to this week's Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball. As always, with me, Jamie Shea, Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe. Well, last Monday marked the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Iraq, which Washington at the time dubbed Operation Iraqi Freedom. 20 years on, I don't suppose many Iraqis or even many outside observers would quite see it that way. The US invasion of Iraq had catastrophic consequences. First of all, for the Iraqi people themselves. Hundreds of thousands of them lost their lives. Millions were driven into exile. Hundreds of thousands more suffered permanent psychological damage or physical injuries, or the fear always of living in constant insecurity. Kurds were pitted against Iraqis. Shias were pitted against Sunnis, and minority communities that have thrived in Iraq, such as Christians or Yazidis, were persecuted, and in the case of the Yazidis, almost wiped out as an ethnic group. Iraq became the subject of foreign interference, for example, Turkey in the north, in the Kurdish areas, and increasingly Iran trying to gain a foothold with the majority Shia population. The United States had planned for the war, but had not planned for the peace. The planning initially undertaken by the State Department was ditched by President George W. Bush and handed to the Pentagon, which had no plans, thinking that the removal of dictator Saddam Hussein by itself would ensure that everybody would live in peace and harmony ever after. A coalition provisional authority was set up, which proved remarkable through its incompetence, being staffed by lots of 20-year-old Americans straight out of university with often quite idealistic agendas, no knowledge of Arabic, no understanding of Iraq or its culture, and living in the green zone in a kind of bubble quite distant from the Iraqi reality on the outside. So the destruction of Iraq as a society and even as a country is one consequence. Secondly, the creation of ISIS, which very much was formed from disgruntled elements in Iraq, particularly the old army when it was disbanded, which meant that having left in 2011, the United States was forced to go back to Iraq later on to put down the caliphate that ISIS had formed in Syria and across the border into northern Iraq. ISIS also produced hundreds of thousands more deaths and casualties through its persecution, particularly, for example, of the Yazidi minority, the enslavement of women, for example, and has left a legacy of now tens of thousands of more old ISIS fighters with their women and children, stateless and marooned in awful camps like Al-Hol across Syria and Iraq, which could be the seedbed for future ISIS militants in the future. The third big casualty was the reputation of the United States, preaching freedom on the one hand, but setting up Abu Ghraib and the prison where waterboarding and torture were practiced on the other hand. The US got a reputation for hypocrisy, which has unfortunately stayed with it ever since. And it's not surprising that in the current debate over Putin's invasion of Ukraine, so many countries in Africa and the Middle East say, well, the Americans did it to Iraq earlier on, trumped up charges of non-existent threats, invading a country, trying to get rid of its regime and install its own allies in their stead. And fourth and finally, the legacy of Iraq was the end of interventions as we knew them before. We made a good start in the 90s in Bosnia and Kosovo with legitimacy, with good plans for the military to help with civilian reconstruction. We didn't create perfect societies, but we did move those countries forward, even Afghanistan in the early years. But the catastrophe of Iraq certainly poisoned the well of the Western appetite for interventions. And when we stood on the sidelines and did nothing in Syria in 2011 and left it all to the Russians, we saw that the consequences could be even worse, with 500,000 Syrians killed and over 14 million displaced from their homes. So 20 years on, is it history? Yes. But should it be forgotten? Should a veil of forgetfulness be pulled over it? Certainly not. The Iraqi war still has lessons for us today. Number one, don't misuse a legitimate campaign for something else. George W. Bush said that this was all part of the global war on terrorism, but there's no evidence that Saddam Hussein, as bad as he was ever in league with Al-Qaeda or involved in the jihadist plots against the West. Number two, if you're going to sort of point to a threat, make sure you get the threat right. The administration and the government of Tony Blair in the UK both pointed to the fact that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction, an imminent threat to the West. But again, those weapons of mass destruction were never found. The United Nations, which carried out inspections after the first Gulf War in 1991, was convinced that those weapons of mass destruction had been destroyed, that the programs had stopped. They were right, but Tony Blair and George W. Bush simply didn't believe them. And unfortunately, the intelligence agencies too often collaborated with governments in coming up with phony evidence, telling leaders what they wanted to hear rather than what they should hear. Perhaps one good outcome of all of that is today intelligence agencies are much more willing to speak truth to power and are much more concerned to get their information right. The way in which the US, for example, was quite accurate in its intelligence on Putin's invasion of Ukraine maybe shows again that some good at least has come out of the old politicized intelligence of the invasion of Iraq. Number three, security is paramount. If you don't get the security picture right, then nothing follows in terms of reconciliation, in terms of reconstruction, in terms of economic progress and development. And certainly don't get rid of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police force in the Iraqi civil administration, as the Coalition Provisional Authority did in Iraq, even if they belong to the old regime, unless you've got something to put in their place. The US will refuse to provide the kind of order that the Iraqi army had provided. So you ended up, on the one hand, with complete chaos and a breakdown of order, and on the other hand, a lot of very, very, very angry young Iraqis who had lost their jobs in the army and the police force. The next lesson is don't over-rely on sanctions, because the effect of the sanctions against Iraq was that they allowed the regime to stay rich by selling its oil, but they made the Iraqi population hungry, lacking essential medicines and supplies, and increasingly alienated and bitter as well. And finally, we need intelligent sanctions or intelligent interventions. If we're going to intervene in the future, let's see how we can do it in a more focused way, hitting the regime, not hitting the population, creating pockets of decency, even if we can't pacify the entire country, helping to train the local forces. So the legacy of Iraq 20 years on is that, yes, Western forces can declare failure, cut their losses, turn their backs, jump on the planes, as they did from Afghanistan or from Iraq, and leave. But the local population cannot leave and is permanently scarred by the experience of what went on. And therefore, can some good still come out of this? Well, a couple of days ago, a BBC radio program called Question Time from Mosul in northern Iraq interviewed a number of young Iraqis who said, yes, on the one hand, that at least the greater freedom had been a positive thing, but they weren't quite sure if that greater freedom was outweighed by the loss of security and the economic deprivations and the sectarian conflicts that they had faced. But the future of Iraq is no longer in American hands or British hands. It's in the hands of the Iraqis themselves, and let's all wish them well. Thank you for watching and listening today, and I look forward to the next Keeping an Eye on the Geopolitical Ball.